So my name is Mike. I am lead horticulturist out here at the Conservation Garden Park, and we're going to talk about how to plant things today. Believe it or not, most of the time we've been doing it incorrectly, so we're going to go over how to do it properly. All right, so question. Do you want a healthy, long-lived tree? Then proper planting might be for you. Side effects include healthier, long-lived trees, better flowers, brighter fall colors, more nesting birds. Sorry, I couldn't help myself on that one. All right, so proper planting makes for longer-lived trees. This is a pretty basic statement, but it is absolutely true. We're finding that most of the problems that we've ever had with trees, almost all of them can be solved the day they were planted, because most of them were actually caused the day they were planted. Trees, shrubs, these are big investments. Like they cost a lot of money to start with. Sometimes you can spend hundreds of dollars on the plant itself. And not to mention just the time that it takes to grow a plant in. Not properly planting a tree could lead to 6, 7, 8 years down the road, that tree failing, and you've kind of wasted like 6 or 7 years time where you could have had a healthy, mature growing in its place. And so really it's worth the effort and the insurance to take some time and make sure we plant the tree properly. So first step kind of in planting a tree properly, it really is going to be picking a tree that is going to fit that spot. So it actually starts during your design process. And then maybe when you hit up the nursery and you're looking for a tree. But when we're picking a tree, we really have to make sure we're picking it for a reason. Like, what is the reason we're picking this tree? Like, why are you going to go out and plant a tree in the first place? Are you planting it for size? You want to don't plant a big tree in a small area and then expect to be able to kind of keep it that way pruned. So picking the right size of a tree. Choose for the planting zone. If it's a zone 9 tree, it's probably not going to work here in the Salt Lake Valley. So don't choose that. Choose it for the purpose. So again, why are you planting this tree? Are you planting it for shade? Are you framing something or screening something off? Are you trying to get fruit? So know why you're planting the tree is actually the biggest step in making sure you have a tree that is properly planted. I mean, because we all want to have a nice looking little tree like this one in the picture here. So speaking of that one in the picture, let's take a look at that one. This tree has a lot of actually problems in the way it is sited in here, and I don't think this was particularly well thought out. This tree is a small tree, so this is a tree that's going to get 20 feet tall, kind of maximum. But it's the way it's shaped, you can kind of see it shaped here. It is really wide at the bottom and then short overall. So what this means is we can't really limb up this tree very much so that we can walk underneath this tree, because we end up with 2/3 of the tree as trunk and then a little bit left at the top. So this tree becomes a little problematic, and it's just not a good tree for this spot, because we really have a hard time getting people to walk underneath it. Because of that wide base, really interferes with the sidewalk. And so I'm constantly limbing this tree up. We're trying to prune it so that it still looks decent, but people aren't being hit in the head as it's walking by. So this tree was not well thought out. And the last thing I'd point out of this one is you see lots of little berries up in this tree. This hawthorn, this is a Crusader hawthorn, has a tendency to drop all of its berries over the same weekend. And so I will come in one weekend and all of this sidewalk will be covered in these little squishy round berries that are hard when they fall, and they actually become a little bit of a slipping hazard. And then as people walk through it, they squish them and become slippery that way too. So it's really this tree was not well thought out. So when you took a look at that tree there and thought, wow, what a beautiful tree, let's really analyze what we need in a tree and what the spot calls for and pick the proper tree. Smaller trees are better. This is something that we found here at the garden that is quite true. When this building that I'm talking about was being built, the contractor brought in quite a few large caliper trees, big thick trunks in these big balled and burlap forms, and planted them. When a couple of them died, we replaced them with smaller pot-grown trees and then planted them out there. Within 3 or so years, not only did they catch up, but 5 years after that, like they were much bigger and growing much healthier than the big trees. So the idea of wanting to put in an instant landscape and having these nice mature trees is appealing to a lot of people. But planting a smaller pot-grown tree that can be grown for a longer period of time, settling in, because it'll settle in a lot quicker. The roots will start out smaller, they'll grow into the landscape. That tree will find itself settling into its position a lot quicker than a big tree that's kind of trying to force into a spot. So when you're out looking for a good tree, pick a smaller tree and go ahead and plant it that way. The bigger the tree is, the longer it takes to settle into its spot, and the longer it'll take to finally really kick into your landscape. So smaller trees, definitely better. There is a better time of year to plant trees than others, and that is going to be in the fall. So the advantage to planting things in the fall is that if you want, you have to look at what the hardest part of the year is on a tree. So the hardest part of the time of the year, the hardest really time for it to deal with is going to be the heat of the summer. That August and July when it's 100 degrees or 103 out, and it's just relentlessly hot day in and day out. Even the evenings are hot. That is the hardest time for a newly planted tree. So the furthest away we can get from that to plant the tree, the better, and that's going to be right after that heat fades. So soon as really late in the summer or the fall starts up, when the air starts cooling off, the nighttime temperatures get a little lower, and the daytime just cool off just a little bit. That becomes a really good time to plant the tree. That give it as much time as possible to grow some roots, get settled in, and get itself a little established before the major heat of the year kicks in. The next best time of the year is going to be in the spring. Earlier you can get it, the better. But spring is great because not only are you're still a good distance away from the heat of the summer, but you have a much better selection. Local nurseries tend to carry a lot of this stuff in the springtime, so you'd probably have an easier time trying to find all the stuff in the springtime than you do in the fall. Even though fall is a slightly better time to plant, but nothing wrong with planting in spring. So okay, so it's going to come as a shock, I think, to a lot of people, but everybody has seen these little planting directions that come with a lot of trees, and the truth is they're not always all that accurate, and in fact they're frequently wrong. So if we just look at this little thing we got here, I can just point out a couple things that jump out as being potentially harmful to the tree. Digging a hole 3 times with the container is great, but it's not really required. We often make holes that aren't much bigger than the pot. We think this gets them out into the native soil just a lot faster. Setting the root ball above ground is absolutely true. You should absolutely do that one. But here's the one that actually that causes, I think, the most problem is combine planting mix and soil and then fill to the ground level and then don't tamp down. We actually do this quite the opposite. We absolutely do not amend that potting that fill soil that we're going to put back in. We're just going to put in plain native soil, unamended, with no compost, no potting mix, no nothing, and we stomp it down pretty hard to make sure that the soil gets a good contact with the roots. So things like that are actually really questionable on these planting instructions. You don't want to give it too cushy an area where those roots can grow into, because the problem is when it hits that hard soil that it's actually going to have to live in, that cushy soil would have encouraged roots that are growing kind of thin, and then when it hits the hard soil, it actually causes a change in that soil texture, and then those roots could actually start turning again, almost like it's growing in a pot. So we really want to avoid that. We want it to grow out into the landscape, so definitely no amendment to that soil. Okay, so first things first, we've bought our tree. It's a good tree. We've got it in a little pot, and so we've decided to we're gonna have to take off all of the packing materials, and I mean all of the packing materials. If it is attached to that plant, here's the time to go ahead and remove it. So we're gonna take it out of its plastic pot. We're gonna remove the twine that might be holding things onto it. We're gonna remove tags that identify what it is, or any other thing attached to that tree. If it's in a cage, or if it's in burlap, because sometimes we have bought trees in a pot, look like they're pot grown, and then we pull them out and realize they're actually balled and burlaps just stuck in a pot. So remove that cage, remove the burlap, remove any twine that's going around it. remove any tags. Let's get all of that material off that thing. Okay, and then the step here is we need to find the trunk flare. The trunk flare is right where the trunk becomes roots and starts to spread out into the landscape. And so it is really tricky. We get lots of potted trees that we'll pull out, and we have to go down sometimes 6 or 7 or 8 inches to actually find where actually that root flare is. And so that root flare is important because we're going to try to plant that, at or slightly above the soil surface. So we really need to know where that is in order to even be able to dig the hole in the first place. So this is why, like this far in, I wouldn't even say like it's not even close yet to time to dig a hole. We really need to know how far to do that. And we're kind of walking through the process to determine that first. But the first things first, find that root flare. We've got to find out where that trunk meets the roots. And you'll notice it's got a slight flare to it as it goes into the roots, and that's the point we're looking for. Okay, and so that is going to be right there. So, and that was actually a bit down in the pot. In fact, we actually didn't notice this little graft point there when we were doing this originally. So we're going to use a pruning saw or our hands or weed knives or something to kind of cut away or pull away all that dirt until we find that root flare. Now we're going to break up the root ball. This gets a little brutal. I think people are often quite afraid to damage the roots when they buy a new tree. Completely the opposite is true here. And while it's nerve-wracking, just go ahead and grab yourself a pruning saw and let's actually make some pretty serious cuts down the side of this plant. We're going to shock it a little bit, and it'll want to grow new roots. And the way it's planted in, it will help it establish that actually much more quickly. But we want to get this thing growing. We want to encourage this. And by breaking up these roots, a couple things happen. We make sure the plant doesn't have any roots that are still circling and that could girdle the plant later. And once we take up a bunch of roots like this, we've actually shocked the plant a little bit and goes, hey, I've lost a whole bunch of roots. And the first thing it's going to want to do is replace all those roots, and that's actually really good for us. That's what we want to have happen. And those roots will be establishing into the native soil, and that's a good way to get this plant settled in. So attacking these roots and getting a bunch shaved off is a really good idea, and this is the next step we're going to do. Like I said, it is a little nerve-wracking when you go at it, but the biggest reason we do this is this thing. Okay, this is what happens when you allow roots to continue girdling. There are a lot of roots that grow in those pots, and they will actually just turn and grow around inside the pot. And if they're allowed to keep getting bigger, as those roots keep getting bigger, those roots will keep getting bigger as the tree gets bigger. So as just the normal branches in a tree get bigger, so do those roots. But you can see this is a little rose of Sharon that really isn't long for this world anymore, because this is going to strangle it out. As those roots continue to get bigger, it will continue strangling out that tree. Same thing has happened here to this tree down here, although this was probably aided by this weed fabric, which causes a lot of compaction around it. This has probably caused some of this problem as well. But this actually is out here at the garden. If somebody walked by, I could actually show them this. This is probably a 20-year-old rose of Sharon. This is in one of the oldest parts of the garden. And so the day this was planted by whoever put it into the ground, they did not do what we were talking about, where we really get in there and cut up the root ball and shave off any circling or circling roots around. And so as this thing has gotten big, it's now going to die. And again, 20 years kind of down the drain on a plant that should be in its maturity, that we're probably going to have to take out. No, we're definitely going to have to take out, because this plant will die. So 20 years, this plant should be entering its its mid-maturity life, and we're going to have to remove it. So it's kind of a shame. It's a lot of wasted time. So this is why we're breaking up the root ball. You can see this has been grown in a pot, and the roots now circling around it like this. These through here, these bigger, thicker roots, they've become somewhat pencil size, and that's not going to shift directions or change directions. That's just going to keep getting bigger, and by the time this is 2 inches around, when a plant is mature, it's going to be the problem where it's cutting off that plant. And so we really need to stop this whole wad of roots and have it growing in the direction that we want. And so again, we break out the weed knife and we do this to it. So you can see this is a cylinder, comes out of the pot as a cylinder, and we're actually going to make this thing a square. Okay, so this is kind of the trend that we've seen. We've seen some research on it, and we've been doing it out here now for quite a while, pretty successfully. Is that we're actually going to take that weed knife and take that cylinder, and we're going to make it a square. We're going to square this entire thing off, and you can see now all of these roots that may have been circling around this pot are now gone. There's plenty of roots still in there. In fact, there's really tons of roots still in there, and so it's got plenty of root area to still live. But all of these problematic roots we've cut away. Okay, so if we're gonna plant the hole, before we dig, we really need to know how deep this hole is going to be. So this is why in the beginning we went ahead and found the root flare. That's going to be right here. We've prepared the root ball. We've shaved off some roots like down here on the bottom that were accumulating on the bottom of this. We've shaved them off down here on the side. And we're going to square this thing off. Okay, and then that will give us this measurement right here, which is the bottom of the root flare to the top of this little to the top of the ball that we have, and this now is how big we're going to dig our hole. So that we don't want to dig any deeper than that. So we're going to dig a hole that turns out just that deep. So here we are. I don't know, halfway or a little more than halfway through a presentation on planting, and we haven't even grabbed a shovel yet. The reason for that is obviously, like, there's a lot of prep work we need to do before we actually dig that hole. Picking the right plant, making sure we know how deep that hole's got to be. Okay, but now it's time to go ahead and dig. So we grab our favorite digging implement. So it could be a usual shovel. This is probably my favorite tool right here. This is a trenching shovel. I'll use it to dig holes as well as digging like irrigation trenches with. But in the middle of summer here at Conservation Garden Park, if you want to come dig a plant, you might be using this tool right here, and that's a mattock. The ground out here, like a lot of places, is heavy clay. It's very solid, and we have planted many a plant by taking that mattock and basically picking a hole in the ground to get something planted. So it can become a little like concrete out here, as I'm sure it can for some of you as well. Just know that there's lots of tools to get into the ground, and that mattock is definitely one of them. So here is what the plant is going to look like in the hole. So we didn't dig the hole, so we knew how what that distance was. And now as we dig, we keep putting that thing down in there just to keep seeing how that it fits. Okay, so there's your root flare level. Here's the ground level. That root flare is going to be either at ground level or just a little bit above. Okay, and sitting a little above is fine because it'll just find its way in there. And the big thing about making sure that hole is the right depth is if you dig it too deep and then have to backfill it in to try to raise the level, that new soil that you backfilled in could end up sinking a bit, and so you could end up the plant could end up being down a little lower than expected. So putting it a little above that point too is also good. So just in case you get settling, because it's really important to make sure that root flare point is sitting either, like I said, right at ground level or slightly above, because any kind of soil and water living right through here in this trunk will actually rot out where it touches, and then eventually that'll just kind of rot out the root, the bark of that plant, and it will eventually kill the plant. So this is really kind of an important step. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and finally, like I said, we're way more than halfway through a presentation on planting, and we're just now finally putting a tree in a hole. So okay, final fit check. We put it in there, measure across there to make sure that's going to be exactly where we want. Make sure the planting hole is the correct depth. All the packing materials are removed. The roots are prepared. And so now it is finally time to go ahead and put the plant in the hole. But again, don't amend the soil. This is something I've now hit on a couple times. But really, we're just going to take the soil that we dug out of that hole and put it back in and tamp it down really good on the side. We really it's a little bit of tough love, but we really need this plant establishing itself in the soil that it has to live in. The sooner it does it, the better the long term that plant is going to be. So it's a little harsh. But we can't really make that situation too cushy for the plant, or we could cause a different set of problems. Time to water it in. This is as much about giving your plant a good drink of water as it is taking a lot of that dirt that we just put in there and washing it down into the air pockets that we've created by the clumping soil. The soil needs to be in good contact with the roots in order for the plant to be able to take up water out of that soil. And so this is an important thing to really get all that water rushed down into that root so you don't have a lot of air pockets. So getting rid of those air pockets is as much the goal as this watering in as giving the plant a good drink of water. Layer of mulch, so thick layer of mulch will help retain a lot of that water, but you'll notice we don't pile it right up against the trunk here. We're finding that mulch, especially finer mulches like compost, bigger, thicker wood chips and chunks of wood aren't as destructive as a finer compost or a soil would be. But you can see we don't want that mulch right up against the trunk. It could help rot out the trunk, and that would also set the tree kind of on a declining path. Okay, so a couple things I'm going to suggest not doing in that first planting. No fertilizing. For the first year, probably two, it does encourage the wrong type of growth. So water it, but don't fertilize it. We're also not going to prune this tree in the first year or so of its life too. The exceptions are if it's already dead, or if you can see it's got a disease in it, or like a really seriously crossing branch that is rubbing on things that has the potential to harm the tree down the road. Those can be you can go ahead and take those off. But by and large, let's not prune that tree. It needs kind of all that leaf area that it can get to grow the type of roots to get itself established into the ground. So for at least a couple years, let's only do minimal pruning if absolutely necessary, but definitely no fertilizing. It really does encourage more top leaf growth and not enough root growth. No staking, if it can be avoided. Now, a lot of times it can't be. We understand that. Of course, this one was getting some wind from both directions, so we ended up having to stake it a little tight. So it's not the best way to do it. At this tight, you actually want to stake it a little loose so it has a little movement. But the first chance you can decide that this tree is actually holding itself up, it's time to remove that stake. You don't want to do this for very long. If you don't have to stake, don't stake. I will always plant a tree and let it go for a few days just to see if it's going to move on its own. But if it never needs me to stake it, I'm just happy to never stake that plant. But if you're in a particularly windy location, you might have to, or sometimes we've dug down in a pot and realized the root ball is way smaller than we expected, and it's got a big canopy and the wind blows it around a little much, so sometimes we do have to stake it. But you do only want to leave the stake on for maybe a year. A year from now, you really want to kind of remove the stuff and really give the tree a good shake and see if it's settling into the ground. Vast majority of the time, you're going to find that is plenty, and you don't need to continue the staking past that. If for some reason you do have to continue staking past that, go ahead and let it go for another year. If for some reason it still hasn't settled into the ground after the year, there might be something else wrong with the plant as to why it is not settling in or really growing its roots into that area to where it still needs to be staked. So at that point, you might want to try to figure out what the actual problem is. But really, a tree stake shouldn't be on a plant for more than a year or so. And you definitely don't want to leave the staking materials attached for very long. You can see this plant right here was staked for a really long time, and in the meantime, the plant grew over the attachment point right there, and that is now a permanent weak point inside that tree because that will never be able to be removed. And so while it might grow over it, it will always be just this piece of rubber stuck in a tree, creating kind of a permanent weak spot there. And you can see this one over here. This is the city park nearby. The stake that it was put on was probably left there for a decade until it eventually started swallowing that stake. So trees will eventually just overrun your stake and materials if you leave them on. So best to take them off as soon as you can. Besides, the faster you can unstake a tree, the more it can move around on its own, the better and stronger that tree will become. Trees develop what we call reaction wood, and so as the tree kind of sways back and forth in the wind, any point that's putting pressure on it will actually develop a thicker wood in that spot to help stabilize the tree. And so it's better to just let it form that reaction wood than than letting it remain weak. So there are a little bit of protections from hazards that we can add. We here at Conservation Garden Park have deer. Deer come into the garden all winter long and big chunks of the year beyond that. So small young trees are really vulnerable to the deer eating them, or even worse, thrashing them with their antlers to try to get the velvet off. And so if you come out in the fall or the winter, you will see all of these little small trees in cages all over the place, and that is really to protect it from the animals. The other is winter injuries. Probably probably the second most common injury we get out here. And what happens is during a winter day, it gets sunny, it gets warm. The sap will start to flow in a tree, and then it will get cold. The sun will go behind a cloud, or it'll just set for the day, and it gets cold fast. And the sap flowing now freezes just below the surface of the bark in a tree, and then that will create this injury on it. This white wrap that we've got here on the right picture helps reflect the sunlight away and keep that from happening. And we'll do that for the first several years until that tree develops a good, thick, corky bark of its own. The last bit here is establishment. Oh, that kind of flowed funny. The last bit is establishment watering. So this is if you plant it in the fall, and this is also above and beyond any kind of water that it's getting otherwise. So if you planted a tree into a shrub bed, a brand new tree, and that shrub bed is already being watered because of everything else in there. Everything I'm about to say will be above and beyond, on top of the normal operations of that watering in that zone. So in the first week after planting a tree, water that thing every day. Just go out and make sure you've soaked it every day. That'll help water not just the tree itself, but again, wash that stuff down to the roots, that soil down to the roots. And then after that, from week 2, at least until the plant goes dormant, you're going to water 3 days a week, every week until it goes dormant. So, like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday type of a schedule, but you're going to want to water it, a good 3 times a week until fall comes and the plant goes dormant. So, sorry, keep going the wrong way. So we've got this type of watering. So in the spring, and this isn't seasonal watering so much as this is watering in year 2 after you've planted in the fall. But in the spring, we're going to water it once a week, but only if it has been dry. If we've had a decent amount of snow that year or rainfall, it's probably not necessary. But if it's been a dry spring, go ahead and water it once a week. We're going to water it a couple times a week as the temperature gets into the hotter parts of the summer. If it's planted in the fall, it should be developing some roots into the system and picking up some water as those roots stretch out. So a couple times a week should be suffice in the summer. But again, you're watching the tree. If it starts to look a little wilty, check the soil around it and see if it's too wet or too dry, because that's the only way to tell the difference between too much water and too little water, since the plant looks exactly the same. And so if you go down there and find out it's just super dry down there, maybe water a little extra more. If you go down there and find out the soil around the base of the tree is really kind of sopping wet, it's probably time to back off a little bit on the water. So, and then in the fall, as the summer temperatures die down, you're going to still want to water that thing once a week until the plant goes dormant. And again, this is all on top of whatever is being watered in that sprinkler zone, because here 1 year in, it's not ready to just be on a drip zone. Once every 7 to 10 days, it'll need water for a little bit more than that. And that second winter that it needs, you still want to keep an eye on this thing. If it's really dry and the soil gets really dry, you may want to water this thing to keep it going, because cold and dry actually will desiccate out a tree and kill it pretty quick. This last winter we had here in the Salt Lake Valley was very cold and very dry, and we actually had quite a few issues with some of our newly planted plants during the winter, trying to keep them alive, and we still lost a few. So, all right, so if you've planted it in the springtime, week 1, water it every day. Week 2, a couple times a week until that point where the weather starts to kick in the summer and starts to get fairly hot. And then during that heat of the summer, that August, July heat of the summer, a good 3 times a week. In the fall, you can decrease that frequency to 1 time per week until the weather cools off, and then keep looking dormant. And again, you're going to want to look at that in that wintertime period to make sure you're not getting too dry even during those winter months. Seems weird to water a dormant tree during the winter, but I promise it helps keep it alive, especially in that the first 2 years after you've planted it. And this is especially true, that concept is really especially true for evergreen plants. Evergreen plants don't go dormant, they still use water even during the winter time. So checking them during the winter and making sure they get some winter watering is really good. If it's snowy, if it's wet, if you go out and the ground is still wet, probably not something to worry about. But again, if it's really dry like we had this last winter, it's really harsh, especially on the evergreen. So they do need to be checked, and really for the first 2 years, that establishment watering period is super important and really does kind of go on for a couple of years. Okay, so kind of a quick recap. Some do's: pick the right plant for the space, spend the time to prepare that root ball, plant it high, and do make sure you establish that plant by watering extra for our first couple of years before you turn it over to that bed's already in-ground watering system. Don't impulse buy the wrong plant for the space. I'm a sucker for a good clearance plant myself, but I've taken many home and they've died on my doorstep because once I got the home, I realized it's the wrong place for it. The thought I had where it was going to go actually doesn't work. So unless the plant you see on clearance is something you already had on your list and you already knew you was going to plant, I would resist that urge. Don't amend the backfill soil with compost. Really just put the regular soil back in. It's just for the best. Don't plant too deep. This is one of the the worst things you can do for a plant because it will rot out kind of at that bottom. It just might not do it for a decade, and it's always hard to trace that back to that day it was planted. Don't fertilize or prune in the first year. Both of those things actually encourage the wrong type of growth. So we just kind of generally want to avoid both those things during those first couple of years. Everything that we've talked about today has been kind of based around the woody plants, so the trees and shrubs. However, we have a very similar process when planting perennial flowers. We pull it out of the pot, all the tags come off, and then we cut up that root ball until we make sure there is no more swirling plants that might choke out or roots to choke out that plant later. And so we're pretty harsh and pretty brutal when we're planting even these perennials out here. So I think we've got some videos coming online eventually to kind of demonstrate this, but being brutal and rough to that root ball is tough love. It'll make it go, make it be beautiful and bigger in the long term, and it's just kind of for the best when we do it. Although the first time someone sees it, they can be quite shocked at how aggressive we get with that root ball. But everything we've talked about here does apply to perennial as well as woody plants. So this planting class kind of does apply to everything that you're going to plant. So all right, so with that said, it's time to see questions, see what we got popped up.
All right, thanks Mike for the presentation. Lots of good information on a subject that's really important.
Very misunderstood for sure.
Yes, lots of bad information out there, and
yes, there is.
Trees are expensive, and planting them wrong can suck because you're throwing money down the drain. So
yeah, and in the long term, more expensive. I mean, I hate to have to pull out a tree that's been in the ground for 7 years because it wasn't planted right, or it was planted in the wrong spot, or planted too close to another tree, or planted something like that. So
yeah,
these are things best thought about early on.
So we've got a few questions that have come in. We've been able to answer some of them, but let's see here. Someone in the Q&A said they planted fruit trees early this spring and didn't know how to shave up the root ball correctly, or didn't shave it up. Is there anything they can do about that situation now?
If it's only been a few months, yeah, I would dig that out and do it properly. I think absolutely you can. I wouldn't. I mean, if it were a year later, I'd be a little more hesitant. But a few months, yeah, I probably wouldn't hesitate at all to go ahead and dig that plant back up, because odds are it'll look just like it did when you planted it, and hasn't really grown much out. So yeah, go ahead and dig that plant up. Do it right this time. Absolutely.
Sounds good. Um, does not fertilizing include the vitamin B transplant liquid?
Yes, it does. Yeah, I would not put any sort of fertilizer on there at all. Um, I think the one exception that pops up is that mycorrhizae stuff, although I really don't think the mycorrhizae works either. So yeah, I wouldn't put any kind of supplements or fertilizer on it for the first couple of years. It just encourages a lot of leaf growth and not enough root growth.
Yeah, from my understanding, if you actually needed to use the mycorrhizae stuff, your landscape's got a whole other level of problems
So
that
so
can't be solved by that sort of thing.
right, and the mycorrhizae that comes in those usually aren't the same mycorrhizae we get in our native soils. And so if you've got a tree that is going to hook up with a mycorrhizae, it'll find it in the native soil, and the mycorrhizae is already there. So yeah, that's the mycorrhizae is not worth purchasing either.
What about root growth hormone?
Yeah, no, nope. You're talking about some sort of auxin supplement, and I still wouldn't do it. The truth is, these plants know how to take care of themselves. You just provide the conditions, and they will then just let them take care of it. But we found, and the research shows, and all the conferences that we've gone to, I'll say no additional, no supplemental, no vitamins, no anything else. Just let the plant establish itself. So yeah, I would avoid all of those things.
What about transplanting plants? Is there anything different or special you need to do with that?
Um, so I mean, a mature woody plant like a tree or shrub is really, really difficult to transplant. So I'm going to answer this question as we're talking about perennials, herbaceous perennials rather than woodies. And the short answer is it's kind of the same. So you're going to dig up a plant out of the ground, and you have to consider to that point almost like you've taken it out of the pot, although you've probably already roughed up the roots in that situation. So, but you're going to do the same things. You're going to cut a lot of the herbaceous site off the top. So cut all the flowers off, and just leave some of the leaves on it. The roots are probably broken up from your digging process, but you're still going to put it back into native soil. No soil amendments in the pot, and then you're going to treat it like the newly planted plant or newly purchased plant, because it's going to be just exactly the same thing. So digging it up is going to be much the same. You probably don't have to rough up the root ball quite as much, although I would still hunt down any thick roots that seem to be curling in there. So it's going to be very much the same.
Sounds good. We're going to do one more question here and then wrap up our morning classes or our morning session. It looks like someone has a pear tree that was originally planted too deep. Now the roots are growing above ground. It looks like there's issues with it. Is there anything that can be done to a tree that was planted too deep?
Not once a couple of years really has passed. So unfortunately, you can try to dig it out and try to find that root flare, but now the thing's kind of living in a hole in the ground. At that point, you can either attempt to leave the tree and just kind of see how much life and how long it's going to live at that point. Although if we're talking about roots already growing above that surface level, there's already a problem with that, especially a fruit tree like a pear tree, because odds are those roots are growing above the graft level, and so you're getting kind of a mix of the rootstock and the scion stock growing together, and that actually doesn't work. My suggestion here, and this is going to sound harsh, I am really impatient when it comes to plants. I just think to myself, 5 years from now, where do I want to be 5 years from now with a fruit tree? I want to be picking fruit off of it. Okay, with this tree, 5 years from now, I really think you're going to be watching it die. Okay, that's my thought. So I would take it out right now, plant a good pear tree in, do it the right way, keep it pruned, and I think 5 years from now, you're picking fruit rather than watching a tree die. So that's going to be my opinion on a lot of plants. If I think there's a chance they're going to go into decline, I think it's time to replace them and do it now. I don't like to waste time watching a tree decline and then die. So I'd rather watch one live and thrive.